What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today's video we're going to finish setting up this view here so that we can type in a number like 255. This works here. You can also go back and change your number to something different. And then we're going to be able to hit spent or saved. If we hit saved, that number is going to increase the number here by 80. If we go in and do spent, which is 45, it's going to subtract that number from our total saved. How that's going to look in Firebase is actually going to be saving this ledger as an array of the amounts that we've saved and spent. So you can see that 85 amount was just added here, and then that 45 was just subtracted. And all of this information is going to actually be totaled up in a saved variable right here as well. So let's get started building this. So our first goal here is to make it so that this 100 is updated when we type in a number here. You can see right now when we click the button, we're just printing out the number of the button we're clicking. But if we type in 255, we want that to say $255. First thing we're going to do for this is create a new string variable and call it amount and set that equal to the string value of 0. Now you might be thinking that this should be an integer because this is an integer. But imagine if they were integers. If you set amount to, if you click 1 and then amount was set to the integer value of 1, to get that to be 12 when you click 2, you would need to actually do some slightly more complex math because you'd have to figure out what to actually add. You'd be adding essentially 10. You'd be adding 10 plus the number that is here. So it's not that complex, but it is much easier to just make it a string where you can say when you click 1, that's the first character in the string, and then when you click 2, that's the second character in the string, and basically build this as a string and then convert that over to a number at the end when we're submitting it. So that's why we're using a string here. Now that we have this amount variable, let's go ahead and change this 100 to actually use the amount. So you can see that now says 0, which is good. And then now we need to change that string value when we click these buttons. In part 1 of this, when we were setting up these buttons, we actually used a one widget function that will build all the buttons. So this will make it easier for us to change what happens when these buttons are clicked. So in the on press tier of the number buttons, we're no longer going to need to print the button. Instead, we're going to set the state of that amount. For right now, we can set the state to be the amount plus equals the number. So the number here, again, is going to be that number that's passed in. So if we do it like this, if the amount is 0 right now, you're going to see when we click another number here, it becomes 02. And then if we click another one, 021. This is close to what we want, but not exactly what we want. We really don't want that 0 to be there once we start typing in other numbers. So let's update the logic of this set state here. We're going to first check if that amount is 0. And again, we need to check if it is a 0 as a string value. And if it is, we're going to set the amount equal to the number. So what this is going to do is, if that initial amount is 0, and we can add the else here. If that initial amount is 0, as it is now, when we click one of these buttons, because this value is 0, it's just going to be replaced with that number. And then any other time, so the number's not 0 now, so any other time when you click it, it is going to append that number. And you can see you can just keep clicking and really adding any amount of money here. We're going to limit the length of the amount to be 5 characters because that is more than enough that anyone should be entering here. That would be like 10,000 or more. We can check right here with an else if, and we're just going to be checking the amount's length. So amount.length equals 5. And if the length is 5, we're just going to set the amount equal to the amount. We're not going to add that number there. So now you'll see if you try and go past 5, nothing actually happens. It'll just stop you there. One quick thing we can add in as well is this haptic feedback dot heavy impact. So We will need to import the services class to use that, but what this is going to do is when you click the button and if it's too long, you're actually going to feel it on the screen. And this will work for both iOS and Android. You'll feel a little bit of a small vibration. It's not really a full vibration, it's just some vibration that's kind of telling you something's going on here, and that will be apparent that nothing's happening. Like if you try and hit this, you're going to feel a little bit of a vibration. Obviously you can't test that on the simulator here, but if you run it on your device, you'll see what I mean. So this is good. We now have the amount here. The next thing we can do is set up this delete button, because you can see when we click this, nothing is actually getting deleted. So we also set this up as a button here. And really what we need to do is a similar thing, in just that we will set the state, and we're going to change that amount value to pull off this last value here. So we can do that with a substring. So we're going to take that amount value and we're going to get the substring of it from the 0 index to the amount's length minus 1. So in this example, it's going to take the string from the 0 index to the index minus 1, which will be these 4 characters here, and it'll drop that last one. Add the semicolon there, and if we save that, you can see if we add these characters and then go back, the 6 is removed, then the 5, then the 5. If you keep going back, you'll see if you clear it out past nothing, it doesn't reset that 0 value. So that's a quick thing we can add as well in an if statement. If the amount's length is less than or equal to 1 when this delete button is clicked, we actually are just going to set that amount equal to 0, and that'll 0 it back out. And then we're going to want that else statement here, and we need to close that bracket. So now if you try it, you can see you can hit any number here, get up to 5 characters, and then clear them out, and when you go back, you'll get back to that 0 amount, and you can start adding numbers again. So now we're able to actually calculate an amount that we want to either spend or save. The next step is to actually get these spend and save buttons working and saving this amount to Firebase. So we do have this action button here, which is actually the action button for both of these, and based on the type, we can differentiate if we're doing a spent or a saved. Let's talk first about how this data is going to be structured in Firestore. You can see here, this is the account that we're currently on. I clear all the other data in this test account, but we have one document with one trip, and that one trip has this budget, which you can see I switched these buttons for testing, but this is the main screen right here. So we have one trip for Austin from the 16th to the 23rd with a $50 budget. And you can see that information is reflected here. If you are interested in setting this stuff up, that's covered in past videos. Now, initially what we did here was you can say you spent or you saved 25, and you'll notice over here the saved goes to 25, and then if you say you saved 25 more, then the saved gets updated to 50. With this new approach being this calculator, we don't want to just update the saved amount like that, although we could do the same logic here where we're just increasing that saved amount or decreasing that saved amount. With this new approach, I actually want to save a ledger or a trail of what the user has input. So you can see right here, we don't know how many events actually occurred. So we don't know that the user saved 25 and then saved 25 again. All we know is that they have a total of 50 saved. If we did have that data on a more granular level, meaning we knew the time that they saved the first 25 and then the time that they saved the next 25, we can use that information to display better metrics to the user. So for instance, we could tell them on Mondays, it looks like you saved the most amount of money. On Tuesdays, you haven't saved anything. Stuff like that. We'll be able to show their data much better. And in the current live version of the app, we're not really making use of that right now, but I do plan to. So it's good to be saving this data now so that later we can update the app to have those features, and the users that were already currently using the app will easily be able to see their data in that way. All that to say, we need to save this data in a new way. Let's go ahead and find our trip model, And we had that double for saved, which we're actually going to keep, and we are still going to update. So in Firebase, in our data, we will still have our total saved here, but we're also going to have more granular information in a different variable. I'm going to call this the ledger. So define this as a list, and this won't be required when we're creating a new trip, so you don't need to put it in this spot here. This part here, when we're updating it to Firebase, we actually don't need it in this area either, because this area, this to.json, is actually used when we're creating a new trip, and we aren't going to create any trips with any ledger data in them. The from snapshot, however, we will take and update, because the from snapshot is when we're pulling the data from Firebase into our app and then creating a trip out of that. So let's add this new ledger. And then we actually want to create a new method in on our trip model that can add a ledger item. So similar to how we create the trip here with this to.json, we're going to do something kind of similar where we're going to be able to push a ledger item to that ledger. And again, this ledger is just a list. So within Firestore, it will just be a list. So go ahead and create this as a map, and it's going to be a string key, and then the value of the key is going to be dynamic. And all that means is the value is not always going to be the same type. We're going to have both a date and an amount type, so one of them will be a date time and one of them will be a double. Then we're going to name this the ledger item, and we're going to want to give this the amount. So that amount that we're typing in over here is going to be passed this ledger item. That amount will be in the form of a string, because again, this is a string value. And then we're also going to take in the type, because this ledger item is going to be called from one of these two buttons. So we're going to want to know if it's if the spent button was clicked or the saved button was clicked, because essentially we're going to have this value of 25, and we're going to need to know if we should subtract it or if we should add it. So let's also take the string type. All right, so within this now, the first thing we want to do is actually convert this amount to a double, because in our database, we don't want to save this as a string. And we can use double parse for that. Then we're going to check if that type was the type of submit. If you go back to the deposit view, you can see in our action button here, which is where we're essentially going to call this, the two types that we're currently using in the action button are save and spent, both lowercase. So we're going to check if that amount, or we're going to check if that type is equal to spent. And if it is equal to spent, that means we're going to be subtracting. So we're going to take that amount double. We're going to set it equal to the double dot parse of a negative value of that amount. So really what this is doing is changing the string to be, for instance, negative 25, and then it's going to double parse that, so then it will be the double value of negative 25.0. This could also be written in theory by putting this in the else statement here, and then set this var here. It's kind of the same thing. I like it better the other way, but it is doing essentially the same thing. Now that we have the correct amount as a double, we can return the data that we're going to be using to send to Firebase. So again, similar to how we did the to.json here, this is just formatting the data that we're going to send to Firebase, but it's not actually going to send the data to Firebase. It's just going to format it. So this ledger item is just going to format this data for Firebase, and then we're going to use this data in another call to actually send that data to Firebase. It might be a little bit confusing right now, but I think once you see it in action, it'll make more sense. So we're going to return here this map, because we do need to return a map from this. And a map is just a key value pair. So within this map, we can create a few keys. The first key we're going to give it is the ledger. And this is going to end up being what is actually shown in Firebase. So similar to how this saved is, we're going to have one that says ledger. And then within this ledger, the type of this is going to be an array. So we can use field value dot array union. And then it's asking for the elements. So now we can actually pass an array to this. And we're going to pass it an array of objects. So the structure of this will be a ledger is going to be on the document. So we're going to have one ledger on this document. And then that ledger is going to have an array. So it's going to have one array. And then that array is going to have multiple items in it. Each of those items in the array is going to be an object that includes a date and an amount. So really we need to create another object here, and we're going to pass it two different key value pairs. So the first one's going to be the date, and you can get the current date time with datetime.now. And then the second one is going to be the amount. And we can get, and this is where we'll use this amount double. So this is going to create the ledger, and the array union here is very important because it's going to be adding this to the current array. So if we call this one time, it's going to add this to the array, meaning there'll be the current date and then the amount that we passed in. And then if we go and type in another amount, it's going to do the same thing and add a second. It's going to add a second thing. So the data in Firestore will kind of look like this with the current date and that second double amount. So hopefully that makes sense. Once we actually get it syncing to Firebase, I think it'll definitely make sense. The last thing we're going to do here is, if you remember that saved value here, we want this to actually get updated when we call this add to ledger. So if we add 25 to the ledger, we want to update the saved value right here as well. And this is actually very simple. We just need to call that saved parameter. We can use field value dot increment and then give it the value of this amount double. Increment here will decrease the number if the amount double is negative. So that will work how we want it to. We do need to add a semicolon here, but this looks good. So we can start using this ledger item to actually pass the data to Firebase. So we need to actually get these buttons to be using this and syncing to Firebase. So back in our deposit view, you can find where we have our action buttons, and the onPressed here right now is just printing out the type. So that part can be removed. First thing we need to do is get an instance of our database, which if you use the provider, this provider I think is slightly confusing because it's kind of a custom provider. It's not actually the provider widget, but either way, you should be able to get a database instance. Since we're going to be using the database, this is going to need to be awaited, which means that this is going to need to be asynchronous. And once we have our database instance, we can get the collection of that user data. You can see that's all the way back here. So we get the user data, then we're going to get the document, and this document is the user's ID. So our provider also is set up to have that current user's ID through the auth get current UID. If you're not quite set up with all this stuff, the past videos do go over all of this. Then now once we're in here, we need to get this trips collection. So find the trip, which is actually a collection. So and then once we're in the trips collection, we need to find this document. The document here is going to be based on the trip. So we actually need to get the trip. You can see on the home page, we do have access to the trip because we're displaying all this trip data. However, on this page, we do not have access to the trip. So we need to be able to pass that trip onto this page. Firstly, comment this out, and we're going to go ahead up to the top of our deposit view and require a trip now. And this is going to be a type trip, and we'll just call it the trip. And then because we're now using the trip, we need to import that package. Then we can require this trip in the deposit view when we make the call to the deposit view. So basically when we're constructing this deposit view, we need to pass it the trip, which in the navigation view is where we're calling the deposit view. One quick thing you'll notice, this is called the home and home state. Let's change that to be the navigation view. I think it'll be a bit easier to read. And then in the main.dart, we just need to call the navigation view instead of the home. All right. We can also remove this location view import. We no longer need that. If you look on the home view, which we're not going to get into refactoring this today, you can see how that was a bit confusing because this is the home view and our navigation view was just called home before. Now it's a little bit easier to understand what is going on there. But on the home view, you can see we do have this future that gets the next trip, and then we actually use a future builder to wait for that trip to be built, or wait for that next trip to be retrieved. And then once it's retrieved, we either show this page, or if there's no trips in that user's account, we'll show some other page that just says start your next trip. We're going to take this same concept and move it to the navigation view. And when we come back and update this home view, we're no longer going to be calling this. We're going to do the same thing we're doing with the deposit view and just pass that trip into this home view when it's being built. But essentially we're going to be copying some of the code from this home view into the navigation view. So firstly, we want this future of next trip, and that will go down here in the build state. Then we're also going to take this did change dependencies and drop that in. Now this function for get next trip, that is defined just down here, and we can copy this entire thing as well. Later we're going to extract this out into a service class, but for now we can just leave it in the navigation view. Import the packages that are missing, and now we should be able to get the next trip. The problem is this next trip here is a future, so this, since it's an asynchronous function and it's returning a trip, but we need to wait for that future to complete, we no longer can build our navigation view out without a future builder. Essentially what we need to do is just create a future builder. Now this has already been done more or less on that home view, so we're going to do a similar thing, but maybe I'll just type this out because it is going to be slightly different. So in our build here, we're going to return a future builder, and the future that it's going to take is going to be this next trip. And then the builder of this is going to be taking the context and the snapshot. And that snapshot is referring to the snapshot of the next trip. The reason we don't just drop this call right in here, because you might be thinking you could just do this, right? Since this is the actual future, just drop that in there. But by setting the variable up here first, it will decrease the amount of calls we're making to this get next trip, because we'll basically have this value here that is called once, and then the future builder can refer back to that without having to call this multiple times. Because this build widget here is going to get rebuilt multiple times. So now that we have the builder here, we're going to add a little bit of logic with if statements. So we want to see if that snapshot connection is done. So the connection state equals done. So that means that this call down here has been completed. One of two things will happen at this point. We're either going to have data or we're not going to have data. So we can check if the snapshot has data, and if it does have data, we're going to set a new variable called trip, and we're going to set that equal to the snapshot's data because the snapshot is going to be returning a trip. So go ahead and define this, and we're going to define this as just an actual trip. So you can see where next trip is a future, and then trip is actually a trip itself. So the trip is what we actually need because we don't want to pass a future to the deposit view. We want to pass a trip to the deposit view. So essentially what this whole future builder is doing is getting that trip value outside of the future. Hopefully that makes sense. So we can add an else here. So if we don't get any data for this video, we're just going to return a container that has a circle progress bar. Over the course of the next videos, we're going to build this out so it's not just that, and we're basically going to be pulling a lot of the logic from the home view into the navigation view and kind of merging those together. Lastly, there is the else if this connection state is not done, and that is going to do the same thing. We're going to actually want this to always be here, this circle progress bar. This part we will be updating, so let's just add a comment here. All right, and this is all grayed out because we're not actually returning anything here. So we need to return something, and really when the trip data is found, what we want to do is build this whole scaffold and all of this. So we're going to create that as a new function that is just going to be called build view. And really all this is going to do is what we used to do in this build function. So you can see we can add a semicolon there, but you can see that we're no longer building the scaffold in the build widget there. We're going to build it outside of it. We're going to build it within this build view here. So this is pretty simple. We just need to do two things. We're going to copy all of this information that is now grayed out from the old widget build, and move it into this build view. So this is really simple. It's just doing our scaffold and setting up our navigation bar. We no longer need this new trip, which we were using in previous episodes, so you can just delete that if you're following along. Now the last thing is we have this final list here. We want to set this list within this build view as well. And now that we have this build view being returned after the trip is set, we can now take this trip and pass it into our deposit view. So a little bit confusing, I think, to wrap your mind around these futures, but to sum it up, we basically want to get a trip object, and that is called trip. And we're getting that through this getNextTrip function. So this getNextTrip function down here, you can see, is going to return a trip from a snapshot. But because this is an asynchronous function, we need to wrap it in a future builder. So that future builder is waiting for that next trip, which again, this variable is defined up here so that we don't keep calling this function every time we need to rebuild the view. And then once we get that data as a trip, we can set that variable here and then finally return the build view, which is essentially just doing everything that we used to do in the build function. And you'll see how easily later we can just pass this same trip into the home view and remove all of that copied logic that we pulled from here. But we're going to save that for a later video. So the deposit view now should have access to this trip because we're passing it in. So we can go back down to our code down here where we were making this call to Firebase. And because now we have the trip, which will be accessible under widget.trip, we can actually just get that document ID, which if you look in Firebase, it is going to be this document ID right here. And then once we have this document ID, we can then call update to update this document with the information that is going to be typed in here. So that information we already set up on our trip model. We set up the format of that information, which is right here. So we're going to just get a ledger item, and pass a ledger item in here. Now we can't just call ledger item, we need to call it on the trip. So widget.trip.ledger item. And then, and actually if we do this, you'll see it takes two parameters. One of them is the amount and the other one is the type. And we can end that with a semicolon. And if we save this, we should be updating the trip there. One thing that I did change is this provider of context auth get user ID. If you go into your AdMob service, or if you go into your auth service, make sure your get current UID is just returning a string. In past videos that used to return a future string, but the updates to Firebase auth now return this as just a string value, so you don't need the future in front of that. Either way though, this should be working. The last thing we do want to add though is the redirect. So once the user enters something here and hits save or spent, we're just going to push them back to the main screen. And I'm just going to copy this over because it will be easier, but the navigation view here will need to be import. And that navigation view is what we just renamed obviously our navigation view. But all this is doing here is reloading us back on the main page, which is going to reset that total amount, there. All right, after restarting the app, if we go over here, you see this says 50 now. If we go to saved and type in another 50 here and hit saved, you'll see it now increases this to 100 because we have our saved value here increment by the amount that we entered. But more importantly, if you go into Firebase, you'll see we now have this ledger here, which has that amount of 50 and the date that we entered it. If we go back in here and add 25 and then hit spent, you'll see this decreases down to 75 as we would expect. And then also our ledger now has that second value here for -25. All right, that is going to be it for this video. We now have this nice ledger, which we can use later on our home screen to show some more detailed data about when people are saving, how much they're saving, and we have this more granular look at the data that they're entering. We still are making use of this saved variable here, so we don't need to sum this up every time we want to know what that total saved is. If you have any questions about this, go ahead and comment them down below and subscribe to see more Flutter videos. All right, ciao for now.